The rain came down in sheets that afternoon in April 1945, turning the muddy roads of Okinawa into rivers of red clay that clung to everything it touched. Staff Sergeant Michael "Mac" Callahan pressed his face against the periscope of the M26 Pershing tank, watching the world outside reduced to a blur of green jungle and gray sky. The tank smelled like oil, sweat, and the metallic tang of ammunition, a scent he'd grown so accustomed to that civilian life now seemed like a distant dream wrapped in the perfume of his mother's kitchen and the lavender his sister wore to church. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Contact left, 200 yards. Private First Class Tommy Reeves called from the driver's hatch, his Georgia drawl somehow managing to sound calm even as his knuckles whitened on the controls. Tommy was 19, with freckles that made him look even younger, and a photograph of a girl named Betty tucked into his helmet that he kissed before every engagement. Mac adjusted his position in the commander's cupola, feeling the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders like the flak jacket he wore. The Pershing was new, so new that most of the Japanese forces they'd encountered had never seen one before. While the Sherman had been the workhorse of the Pacific Theater, grinding through island after island with its 75mm gun, the Pershing represented something different, something the enemy hadn't planned for. Its 90mm gun could punch through armor that would laugh at a Sherman's shells, and Mac had seen what it could do to bunkers, buildings, and the few Japanese tanks they'd encountered. But nobody had told them about the Zeros. "Gunner, traverse left. Louder, have an AP round ready," Mac commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. Corporal James "Jimmy" Chen moved with practiced efficiency, his small frame somehow perfect for maneuvering in the cramped space of the tank's interior. Jimmy had been a mechanic in San Francisco before the war, and his hands had a delicate precision that made him the best loader Mac had ever worked with. He could load a shell faster than most men could blink, and his quiet competence had saved their lives more than once. The gunner, Sergeant First Class Robert "Bobby" Martinez, already had his eye pressed to the sight, his breathing slow and measured. Bobby had been with Mac since North Africa, though they'd only gotten the Pershing 2 months ago after their Sherman took a direct hit from a German Panther outside of Cologne. Bobby had dragged Mac from that burning metal coffin, and Mac had returned the favor in a Belgian forest when a sniper's bullet had grazed Bobby's temple. They didn't talk about it. They didn't need to. "I got movement in the tree line. Can't make it out yet. Could be infantry." The radio crackled to life, and Lieutenant Morrison's voice cut through the static. "All Able units, this is Able 1. We've got reports of enemy armor moving through Sector 7. Intelligence suggests Type 97 Chiha tanks, maybe some Type 95 Hagos. Nothing our guns can handle, but stay sharp. They've been getting desperate. Morrison out." Mac allowed himself a thin smile. The Japanese tanks were outdated by American standards. Their armor was thin, their guns underpowered. The Type 97's 57mm gun couldn't penetrate the Pershing's frontal armor from any practical range, and the Type 95 was even worse. It was almost unfair, like bringing a rifle to a cannon fight. But Mac had learned long ago not to underestimate any enemy, especially one fighting for their homeland with the desperation of last stands. "Tommy, bring us up slow. Stay in the tree cover as long as you can," Mac instructed, reaching up to wipe the condensation from the inside of his periscope. The interior of the tank was hot despite the rain outside, the engine's heat radiating through the metal shell. Sweat ran down Mac's back, soaking into his undershirt. They'd been on Okinawa for 3 weeks, and every day felt like a year. The island was supposed to be the last stop before Japan itself, and everyone knew it. The Japanese knew it too, which meant every engagement was fought with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal. Mac had seen soldiers charge their tank with nothing but bayonets and grenades, had watched kamikaze pilots turn their planes into guided missiles aimed at American ships offshore. The word kamikaze means divine wind, and there was something terrifyingly poetic about young men turning themselves into storms of fire and metal. The Pershing lurched forward, its tracks grinding against the mud and stone. Through the periscope, Mac could see the devastated landscape, trees stripped of their leaves by artillery, craters filled with rainwater that reflected the gray sky like dead eyes staring upward. There had been a village here once. Mac knew because he'd seen the photograph in the briefing tent. A place of rice paddies and wooden houses with curved roofs, a small shrine at the crossroads where locals would leave offerings of fruit and incense. Now it was nothing but rubble and ghosts. "I got something," Bobby said suddenly, his voice sharp. 11 o'clock, distance 300 yards. It's... Wait, that's not a tank. Mac swung his periscope left, straining to see through the rain and smoke that seemed to perpetually hang over the battlefield. For a moment he saw nothing but the gray-green blur of destroyed jungle. Then movement caught his eye, something low and fast, painted in the mottled greens and browns of Japanese camouflage. "That's a gun emplacement," Jimmy said from his position, having risked a quick look through his own vision port. "Looks like a Type 88 75mm. They're dug in good." Mac felt his jaw tighten. The Type 88 wasn't powerful enough to penetrate the Pershing's armor from the front, but it could damage the tracks, and an immobilized tank was a dead tank. "Bobby, put an HE round into that position. Jimmy, load high explosive." "HE up," Jimmy called seconds later, the metallic clang of the breech closing echoing in the confined space. "On the way," Bobby announced, and the world exploded into noise and fire. The 90mm gun roared, the entire tank rocking back from the recoil, despite its 46 tons. Through the periscope, Mac watched the shell arc through the rain-heavy air and impact directly on the gun emplacement. Dirt, sandbags, and pieces of metal erupted into the air, and for a moment, Mac thought he saw something else. A body, maybe, or pieces of what had been a body, tumbling through the smoke. He forced himself not to think about it. That was someone's son, someone's brother, maybe someone's father. But if Mac thought about that every time they fired, he'd go insane. So he did what every tank commander learned to do. He compartmentalized, he focused on keeping his crew alive, and he saved the guilt and horror for the nightmares that came later. "Good hit," Mac said, his voice professional. "Tommy, forward 20 yards, then hold position. Keep us hull down if you can." The Pershing moved forward, its engine growling like some prehistoric beast. They crested a small rise, and suddenly the battlefield opened before them like a hellish painting. Mac could see American infantry advancing through the mud, their olive-drab uniforms dark with rain and dirt. Medics crouched over wounded men while others fired into the tree line, where muzzle flashes sparkled like deadly fireflies. A Sherman tank burned 50 yards to their right, black smoke pouring from its hatches, and Mac said a silent prayer that the crew had gotten out. "Multiple contacts," Bobby called out, urgency creeping into his usually steady voice. "I got infantry, lots of them, moving through the rice paddies at 2 o'clock. And, Jesus, Mac, I got tanks, 3 tanks coming out of the village ruins at 10 o'clock. Mac felt his heart rate increase, felt the familiar cocktail of fear and adrenaline that had kept him alive through 2 years of war. "Identify those tanks. Are they Type 97s? There was a pause as Bobby strained to see through the rain and smoke. "Affirmative. Type 97 Chihas. They're moving in formation. Looks like they're trying to flank the infantry." "Good," Mac said. And he meant it. The Type 97 was no match for the Pershing. Its 57mm gun might as well be shooting pebbles for all the good it would do against their armor. "Bobby, priority target is the lead tank. Jimmy, keep those AP rounds coming. Tommy, angle us about 30 degrees right. I want our frontal armor facing them when they spot us." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, each man knowing his role, trusting the others to do theirs. This was what months of training and weeks of combat did. It turned 5 individuals into a single organism with one purpose: survive and kill.
Through the periscope, Mac watched the Japanese tanks emerge from the ruins like metal beetles, their short-barreled guns traversing as they searched for targets. They were small compared to the Pershing, almost toy-like, and Mac knew their crews were probably terrified, heading into battle in machines that were obsolete before the war even started. But they came anyway, because that's what soldiers did. They followed orders, they fought for their country, and they hoped to survive another day. "Range?" Mac asked. 400 yards in closing," Bobby replied. "They haven't spotted us yet." "Hold fire. Let them get to 300. I want a sure kill on that first shot." Mac's hand rested on the radio handset, ready to call in their position and contact report. Around them, the battle continued its chaotic symphony, the crack of rifles, the thump of mortars, the screams of wounded men in 3 languages, and somewhere in the distance, the drone of aircraft engines. And that's when Mac heard it, a sound that didn't belong, that sent ice water through his veins despite the heat of the tank. It was a high-pitched whine, growing louder, coming from above. He jerked his periscope upward, craning to see through the limited viewport. "Aircraft!" Mac shouted, his voice cracking with sudden urgency. "We got aircraft inbound, coming from the north!" The tank moved, but there was nowhere to go. A tank couldn't outrun an airplane, couldn't hide from something moving at 200 miles per hour. All they could do was pray that whatever was coming wasn't interested in them. But Mac's prayers went unanswered. Through the periscope, he caught a glimpse of it. A Mitsubishi A6M Zero, its distinctive profile unmistakable even through the rain. The Zero was a legend in the Pacific, a fighter plane that had dominated the skies early in the war with its incredible maneuverability and range. It was painted in the dark green camouflage of the Japanese Navy, and Mac could see the red circle on its fuselage, the rising sun that marked it as enemy. "It's coming around for a strafing run," Bobby yelled, and he could hear the fear in his voice, the same fear that was making Mac's hand shake as he grabbed the radio handset.
"All Able units, this is Able 3. We have enemy aircraft. Single Zero making an attack run on our position. Request air support. Over." The radio crackled, and Morrison's voice came back, tense but controlled. "Able 3, roger your contact. Be advised, air support is engaged with multiple bogies over the fleet. You're going to have to handle this one on your own. Good luck. Out." Mac wanted to scream, wanted to curse, wanted to demand why the hell they'd sent tanks to do a job meant for anti-aircraft guns. But there was no time. The Zero was coming in low and fast, lined up perfectly with their position. Mac could see the wink of its machine guns as they opened fire, could see the tracers arcing through the rain like deadly fireworks. "Button up," Mac ordered, dropping down into the turret and slamming the hatch shut above him. The interior of the Pershing suddenly felt even more cramped, the walls pressing in as the sound of machine gun bullets began to ping against the armor. Most of the rounds deflected harmlessly off the thick steel, but Mac knew that wasn't the real danger. The Zero might have bombs, or it might make another pass, and eventually something would find a weak point, a vision port, a hatch seal, the engine deck. "Bobby, can you traverse the main gun up high enough to hit that thing?" Mac asked, knowing it was a desperate question even as he said it. Tank guns weren't designed for anti-aircraft work. They were made to fire at targets on the ground, at horizontal trajectories. "The mount only elevates to 20 degrees. Unless he comes in real low, real level, I got no shot." The strafing run ended, and Mac could hear the Zero's engine fading as it pulled up and away. He risked opening the hatch a few inches, peering out into the chaos. The Japanese tanks were still advancing, using the air attack as cover, and American infantry were scrambling for whatever shelter they could find. One man wasn't moving, and Mac could see the dark stain spreading in the mud around him. "He's coming back around," Tommy said, his voice tight. "Coming from our 6, low angle." Mac's mind raced. The Pershing's .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the commander's cupola might be able to engage the Zero, but that meant exposing himself, standing up in the hatch while a fighter plane bore down on them. It was suicide. It was also their only chance. "Jimmy, Bobby, keep that gun loaded and ready for those tanks," Mac ordered, his voice somehow steady despite his racing heart. "If I go down, Bobby takes command. Understood?" "Mac, don't," Jimmy started, but Mac was already moving. He threw open the hatch and pulled himself up, the rain immediately soaking him, the wind from the Zero's approach whipping at his face. His hands found the .50 cow's grips, and he swung the heavy weapon around, searching the sky. The Zero was there, growing larger every second, its propeller a blur of motion, its guns already winking with muzzle flashes. Mac opened fire, the .50 cal bucking against his shoulders, the sound deafening even over the storm and battle. Tracers reached out toward the Zero like desperate fingers, and Mac walked his fire across the sky, leading the target the way his instructors had taught him back at Fort Knox a lifetime ago. The Zero didn't break off. It came on like a meteor, like destiny, like death itself. Mac could see the pilot now, just a shadow behind the canopy glass, could imagine the young man's hands on the controls, his finger on the trigger, his mind filled with thoughts of honor and sacrifice and the Emperor's divine will. And then something impossible happened. Mac's tracers found their mark, stitching across the Zero's engine cowling, but it wasn't the .50 cal that did the real damage. As if moving of its own accord, as if guided by some divine hand or devil's bargain, the Pershing's main gun fired. Mac felt the concussion, heard the roar, saw the muzzle flash as he held onto the .50 cal for dear life. The 90mm armor-piercing shell, designed to punch through tank armor at 1,000 yards, moving at 2,800 feet per second with the force of a locomotive, caught the Zero in its midsection. The aircraft simply ceased to exist as a coherent object. One moment, it was a sleek killing machine, and the next it was an expanding fireball of metal fragments, burning fuel, and human remains. The explosion was so close that Mac felt the heat wash over him, felt pieces of debris patter against the Pershing's armor like lethal hail. The shockwave nearly threw him from the cupola, and only his death grip on the machine gun kept him from falling. His ears rang, his eyes watered from the smoke and heat, and for a moment he couldn't process what had just happened.
"What the hell was that?" Tommy's voice came from below, muffled and distant through Mac's ringing ears. Mac dropped back into the turret, his hands shaking, his mind reeling. He looked at Bobby, who stared back with wide eyes, his hand still on the firing trigger. "Did you—" Mac started, couldn't finish. "The barrel was elevated," Bobby said, his voice barely a whisper. "When you opened up with the .50, the whole tank shifted. The suspension compressed and the barrel came up. I saw the Zero in my sight. I saw it, Mac, lined up perfect, and I just pulled the trigger. I didn't think. I just reacted." Jimmy let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "You shot down a plane with a tank gun. You shot down a goddamn Zero with a 90mm AP round." The radio exploded with chatter, multiple voices talking over each other, demanding to know what happened, who fired, what the hell was that explosion. Through the periscope, Mac could see American soldiers standing up from their positions, pointing at the sky, at the falling debris, at the Pershing sitting there like some avenging angel of metal and fire. But there was no time to process it, no time to celebrate or question. The Japanese tanks were still coming, now just 200 yards away, and their guns were traversing toward the Pershing. The infantry and the rice paddies were advancing under covering fire. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Load AP," Mac commanded, his voice hoarse but firm. "Bobby, target the lead Type 97. Tommy, forward 10 yards, then halt. We finish this." As the crew snapped back into action, as the Pershing's gun roared again and the lead Japanese tank exploded into flames, Mac's mind was still trying to process what they'd done. They'd killed a Zero with a tank gun, something that should have been impossible, that would sound like a tall tale when he tried to tell it later, that would change everything about how this crew, this war, this moment in history would be remembered. But Mac didn't know that yet. He didn't know that word of their impossible shot would spread through the ranks like wildfire. He didn't know that Japanese forces would begin to fear the Pershing in ways they'd never feared American armor before. He didn't know that somewhere in the Japanese command structure, officers were about to receive a report that would fundamentally change their understanding of what American tanks were capable of. All Mac knew was that his crew was alive, the Zero was dead, and the battle was still raging around them.
Everything else would have to wait. The rain continued to fall, washing away blood and oil, turning the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and memory. And in the eye of that storm, the Pershing sat like a steel monument to the impossible, its 90mm gun still smoking, its crew still breathing, still fighting, still alive. Before Okinawa, before the Pershing, before he became the man who commanded a crew that shot down a Zero with a tank gun, Mac had been someone else entirely, someone simpler, someone who believed the world made sense. Michael Patrick Callahan had grown up in Pittsburgh, in a row house on the south side, where the air always smelled like steel mills and coal smoke, where his father worked double shifts at Jones and Lawling Steel Company, where his mother hung laundry on a line strung between buildings and prayed the rosary every night for her 3 children. He'd been 23 when Pearl Harbor happened, working as a machinist apprentice, dating a girl named Rose who worked at Kaufman's department store and laughed at all his jokes even when they weren't funny. They'd talked about getting married, about buying a house in Squirrel Hill, about having kids who'd grow up in a world without depression and war. Then December 7th changed everything, and Mac enlisted the next day because Patrick was already in the Marines and someone had to keep the family honor intact. Rose had cried when he told him. She'd cried and held on to his arm in front of the recruiting office and said she'd wait for him, that she'd be there when he came home. Mac had believed her. He'd worn her photograph next to his heart through basic training, through armored school, through the voyage across the Atlantic. But letters became less frequent, and by the time he was in North Africa, they'd stopped coming entirely. His mother wrote to tell him that Rose had married an Elkie accountant with flat feet and a 4F classification. She wrote that Rose was sorry, but she couldn't wait forever, couldn't spend her best years wondering if Mac would come home in a box. Mac told himself it didn't matter, that he understood, that war changed everyone and everything. But late at night, when the tank was quiet and his crew was sleeping, he'd take out that photograph and wonder what might have been. Wonder if that accountant held her the way Mac used to, if she laughed at his jokes, if she still wore the cheap perfume she'd bought at Woolworth's that smelled like gardenias. The memories came unbidden now as Mac sat in the commander's position, watching the rain continue to fall outside. The battle had moved on, the Japanese tanks destroyed, the infantry pushed back, the sector secured for now. Lieutenant Morrison had ordered them to hold position, to guard the crossroads while combat engineers cleared the road ahead. It meant hours of waiting, of tension, of watching for the next attack that could come at any moment.
"Hey, Mac," Tommy said from the driver's position, his voice pulling Mac from his reverie. "You ever gonna tell us how you ended up in tanks? I mean, a smart guy like you could have got officer, could have been flying a desk somewhere safe." Mac smiled despite himself. Tommy had been asking him that question in various forms since they'd first crewed together 2 months ago. "Told you before, Tommy, tanks made sense to me. Big, loud, straightforward. You point them at the enemy, you pull the trigger, you hope you live to do it again tomorrow." "That's not an answer," Jimmy chimed in from his position by the ammunition racks. He was cleaning his carbine, a ritual he performed 3 times a day with almost religious devotion. "That's deflection. Bobby, back me up here." Bobby looked up from where he was checking the gun sight's calibration, a process that involved tiny adjustments and careful measurements. "Leave him alone, Jimmy. Man's entitled to his secrets." "No secrets," Mac said, surprising himself with the honesty in his voice. "My brother died in the Pacific, Marines, Guadalcanal. When I enlisted, I figured I'd follow him, join the Corps, maybe get a chance to avenge him or some romantic bullshit like that. But the recruiter looked at my file, saw I was a machinist, and said the Army needed tank crew. Said machines were the future of warfare, that the side with better tanks would win the war by Christmas. So I signed up for armor. Figured if I couldn't fight like Patrick, I could at least fight like something he'd respect. And then Fort Knox happened, and I fell in love with these damn things." Mac patted the interior wall of the Pershing, the metal cool under his palm. "You spend enough time in a tank, it becomes part of you. You learn its sounds, its smells, its temperament. You learn that this particular transmission grinds in 3rd gear, that the left track tends to throw more often than the right, that the heater only works if you kick it twice and pray." "You fell in love with a death trap," Tommy observed, but there was affection in his voice. "Man, you really are crazy." "We're all crazy," Bobby said quietly. "Otherwise, we wouldn't be here." It was true, Mac reflected. Sane men didn't volunteer to sit in a metal box that attracted every anti-tank gun, artillery shell, and tank round on the battlefield. Sane men didn't close themselves into a space where a single penetrating hit could turn them all into burning corpses before they could scream. But here they were, 5 men from different backgrounds, different cities, different lives, bound together by the shared insanity of being tank crew. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Tommy Reeves had been a farm boy from rural Georgia, the youngest of 6 children, who joined up because staying home meant watching his father drink himself to death 1 bottle at a time. He drove the Pershing the way he'd driven tractors, carefully, methodically, with a farmer's patience and a farmer's understanding of machinery. He wrote letters to Betty every day, long, rambling letters about everything and nothing, about the weather and the food and his crewmates, carefully avoiding any mention of combat or death or fear. He told Mac once, late at night, that writing those letters was the only thing that kept him sane, that kept him believing there was a world outside the war. Jimmy Chen had a different story entirely. Born in San Francisco's Chinatown, he'd grown up speaking Cantonese at home and English in the streets, navigating between 2 worlds that never quite fit together. His father ran a restaurant on Grant Avenue, and Jimmy had been expected to take over someday, to marry a nice Chinese girl his parents picked out, to have children who would continue the family business. But Jimmy wanted more. He wanted to prove he was as American as anyone else, wanted to show that Japanese weren't the only Asians who could fight. When he had enlisted, his father hadn't spoken to him for a month. His mother had cried, but Jimmy had gone anyway, and now he loaded shells with the same precision he'd once used to prepare dim sum. Bobby Martinez carried his own ghosts. He'd grown up in Los Angeles, in a neighborhood where speaking Spanish was a liability, and having brown skin meant cops looked at you twice. He joined the army to escape poverty, to send money home to his mother and 4 younger siblings, to be something more.
Just another Mexican kid destined for a factory job or a labor camp. The army had given him purpose, had taught him that his hands, the same hands that had picked fruit in California fields, could operate a tank gun with deadly accuracy. He'd learned to love the precision of gunnery, the mathematical certainty of ballistics, the way a well-aimed shot could change the course of a battle. And then there was Specialist Marcus Doc Washington, their usual bow gunner who wasn't with them today because he'd taken shrapnel to the leg 2 weeks ago and was recovering at a field hospital. Doc had been a medical student at Howard University before the war, a quiet intellectual from D.C. who'd enlisted despite his deferment because he'd wanted to serve, wanted to prove that black soldiers could do more than just dig ditches and drive trucks. He'd manned the bow machine gun with the surgeon's calm, and he'd patched up more than a few wounds with supplies he kept in his personal kit. Mac missed having him in the crew, missed his steady presence and his ability to quote Shakespeare in the middle of a firefight. In Doc's place today, they had a temporary replacement, Private First Class Danny Sullivan, a freckle-faced kid from Boston who looked about 16, but swore he was 19. Danny hadn't said much during the battle, had done his job with the bow gun competently, but without the instinctive precision Doc brought. Now he sat at his position, cleaning the .30 caliber with shaking hands, and Mac could see the 1,000-yard stare beginning to form in his eyes. "First combat?" Mac asked, gently, moving to sit beside the kid. Danny nodded, not meeting Mac's eyes. "Yeah. I mean, I've been in the line for a week, but this was different. The Zero, the tanks, all those bullets hitting the hull. I kept thinking, this is it. This is where I die." Mac put a hand on the kid's shoulder, felt the trembling beneath his palm. "You did good, Danny. You kept firing. You didn't freeze up. That's more than a lot of men can say about their first time under fire." "I threw up after," Danny confessed, his voice barely a whisper.
Soon as the shooting stopped, I opened the hatch and puked my guts out. The other guys must think I'm a coward. The other guys understand, Mac assured him. Tommy threw up his first 3 times in combat. Jimmy couldn't stop his hands from shaking for a week. Bobby had nightmares so bad he'd wake up screaming. And me? I froze up completely the first time a shell hit near us. Just sat there like a statue while my commander had to shake me back to reality. We've all been where you are. The kid looked up then, hope and doubt warring in his young eyes. Really? Really. Combat isn't like the movies, kid. It's loud and confusing and terrifying, and anyone who says they aren't scared is either lying or insane. The trick is to be scared and do your job anyway. You managed that today. You'll manage it tomorrow, and eventually it becomes, I won't say normal, but manageable. The kid nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Mac wanted to tell him more, wanted to explain that the fear never really went away, that he still felt it every single time they rolled into combat. But some lessons had to be learned through experience, through surviving one battle and then another, until you either made it home or you didn't. "Hey, Mac," Bobby called from the gunner's position. "Morrison on the radio. Wants a status report and our ammunition count." Mac moved back to the commander's position, picking up the handset. "Able 1, this is Able 3. Crew is intact, no casualties. Tank sustained minor damage to the commander's cupola, some dents and scratches from debris, but nothing that affects operations. Current ammunition count is 23 rounds of 90mm AP, 15 rounds of 90mm HE, 800 rounds of 50 caliber, and approximately 4,000 rounds of 30 caliber. Over." Morrison's voice came back crisp and professional. "Roger that, Able 3. Good work out there. That Zero kill is already making waves up the chain. Colonel wants a detailed report when we get back to base. For now, hold your position. We're waiting on sappers to clear a potential minefield before we advance. Should be about 2 hours. Try to get some rest if you can. Out." Rest. Mac almost laughed at the suggestion. How do you rest when you're sitting in a metal box that could become your coffin at any moment? How do you relax when you know that the enemy is out there somewhere, planning their next attack, preparing to kill you and everyone you cared about?
But orders were orders, and Mac knew his crew needed downtime. They'd been in action for 6 hours straight, adrenaline and fear keeping them sharp. Now they'd crash, and he needed them to eat, to hydrate, to decompress before the next engagement. "All right, listen up," Mac announced. "We've got 2 hours. Tommy, you've got first watch. Keep your eyes on the tree line and that ridge line to the east. Bobby, check all the systems. Make sure that Zero's debris didn't damage anything critical. Jimmy, inventory our rations and water. Danny, get some sleep. You look dead on your feet." "What about you, Mac?" Tommy asked. "I'm going to write a letter," Mac said, pulling out his battered notebook and a pencil stub from his jacket pocket. "Haven't written to my sister in 2 weeks. She'll be worried." It was a ritual he'd maintained throughout the war, writing to Catherine, telling her about the weather and the food and the guys in his crew, carefully editing out anything that might frighten her. He wrote about Tommy's stories of farming, about Jimmy's cooking experiments with sea rations, about Bobby's obsession with baseball statistics. He wrote about the landscape, the tropical beauty of the islands when you could forget that people were dying there. He wrote about hope and home and the future they'd have when this was all over. He never wrote about the combat, the death, the fear. He never wrote about the smell of burning flesh, or the sound a man made when he was dying, or the way his hand shook sometimes for no reason at all. He never wrote about Rose or Patrick or the nightmares that came when he managed to sleep. "Dear Kathy," he began, the pencil moving across the page in his careful script. "I hope this letter finds you well and that your nursing classes are going smoothly. Things here are fine, just the usual routine of military life. The weather has been rainy lately, which I'm sure you'd appreciate after all those hot days we had last month." He paused, trying to think of something positive to share,
Something that wouldn't be alive but wouldn't be the truth either. His pencil hovered over the page, and he found himself thinking about the Zero instead. About that moment when Bobby's shot had connected, when the impossible had become real. "We had an interesting day today," he continued. "Without getting into details, let's just say my crew accomplished something remarkable, something that people are probably going to be talking about for a while. I'm proud of them, Kathy. These boys, and they are boys, really, despite what the war has tried to make them, are the best men I've ever served with." It was true, Mac realized as he wrote it. He'd served with other crews, other men in other tanks, but this crew, this combination of talents and personalities was special. They anticipated each other's needs, moved together like parts of a well-oiled machine. When Bobby fired, Jimmy had the next round loaded before the breech was fully open. When Tommy drove, he seemed to know instinctively what Mac needed: cover, a firing position, and escape route. They were good. They were damn good. And that scared Mac more than he cared to admit, because good crews drew dangerous assignments. Good crews got sent to the hardest fights, the toughest targets. Good crews died just as easily as bad ones, but they died fighting enemies that other crews couldn't handle. "Tell Mom I'm eating well and sleeping enough," he wrote, both statements being generous interpretations of reality. "Tell her I go to services when I can and that I still have the rosary she gave me. Tell her I'm being careful, that I'm not taking unnecessary risks, that I'll come home to her when this is all over." The lies felt like stones in his mouth, heavy and uncomfortable. But what else could he write? That he'd stood in an open hatch while a Zero strafed them? That he'd watched men burn alive in their tanks? That he sometimes wondered if it wouldn't be easier to just close his eyes and let whatever happened happen?